think of The Legend of Zelda, what comes to mind? Probably epic adventures, good versus evil, and coming of age, and maybe even the courage to fight. The last thing that would come to mind is a small-scale, personal, and emotional tale about a small island. But this is exactly what we're talking about today. Link's Awakening sits in a very interesting place, wedged between arguably the two most impactful Zelda games of all time, Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. Because of this and its small nature, it feels like it doesn't get the recognition it truly deserves. It doesn't have a grand adventure of saving the world, but in comparison it has one of the most emotional and impactful stories of any Zelda game. So without further ado, here is a look at Link's Awakening, the small but impactful journey. Now, after the defining title that was Link to the Past, how exactly do you follow that up? Well, if you're Nintendo, you make the first portable Zelda game. This really proved that handheld gaming could stand toe-to-toe with console gaming, as having a whole new Zelda game on this system that you can take anywhere was probably a pretty cool thing when it came out. Now, I am playing on the Switch remake for this video, which is absolutely beautiful, by the way, but I think the team wanted to make the adventure a much smaller scale than the previous games. And the fact that, spoilers by the way, everything takes place in a dream really lets them be more creative, as there's no limit when it's a dream, which I believe made this game better. But now, let's go into the wonderfully bite-sized adventure of Link's Awakening. As you boot up the game, you are greeted by a stunningly beautiful animation of Link stuck in a storm out in the sea. And Nintendo, please make a Zelda anime. You keep on teasing us with these little animated cutscenes, and it would be just amazing if we got an actual Zelda anime. I know it probably won't happen because of the live action movies being made, but damn it, a man can dream. This looks amazing. After Link gets struck by lightning though, he washes up on the shore of an island called Koholint, a beautiful little island full of interesting characters. One thing that really makes this game unique as a Zelda game is how connected you are to the characters. Of course you cared about characters in other Zelda games, but in Link's Awakening, it really feels like the characters are the heart of the story. And speaking of characters, Marin finds Link washed up on the shore. Marin is the character the player will become the most attached to throughout the game. She's sweet and kind and a very good singer, with hopes of leaving the island to be a singer throughout the world. In the short runtime of this game, Marin really becomes a character you care about and get to know a decent bit. And this is something that goes for a lot of the characters in the game. Throughout your journey, you meet and help a ton of residents of the island, to the point where the trading quest is actually required to beat the game, which I think is a first in any Zelda game. This is all to say that the game intentionally wants you to learn about and care for these characters, which is something very different from the grandiose plots of most Zelda games. This makes it a very different and refreshing experience that's a character-focused Zelda plot. But getting back on track, after Marin finds Link on the shore, she brings him to her house so he can rest. Afterwards, you're told that your sword is back on the shore, and you're given your shield, so off you go. After a quick walk, you talk to an owl that tells you you need to wake the windfish to leave the island, and to head north. You get your sword back, and that's it! The game's officially begun. With how long Zelda intros can be, it's always refreshing to have an intro that's quick and simple, but still sets up everything in an interesting manner. So now that the game has officially begun, we venture forth into the mysterious woods to get the key to the first dungeon. But this goofy-ass raccoon is blocking our way, so we have to get this mushroom and get it turned into magic dust from the witch. After which, we find out that the raccoon is actually Tarin, Marin's father. Right off the bat, we're already forced to interact with the inhabitants of the island and their quirks. But after going through the forest, we get the Tail Key, so now we can access the first dungeon, Tail Cave. Now, because this is the first dungeon in the game, it is by far the most easy and simplistic, but that's not to say it's bad. For a first dungeon, Tail Cave is still a competent and enjoyable dungeon experience. It teaches you all the basic things you need to know for the dungeons, like keys, exploration, and puzzle solving. One thing the Switch version added is that now the compass beeps when you're in a room with a key you haven't gotten yet. This is very useful, as there's a ton of keys in this game that are locked behind killing every enemy in a room, and while you're taught this in the dungeon, this makes the compass an item you want to get early on, as killing every enemy in every room can be very time consuming just because you don't want to miss a key. Another thing that you're introduced to here is the Stone Beak. There is one of these in every dungeon, like the compass in the dungeon map, but they serve a different purpose. Because some of the puzzles are uniquely cryptic in this game, the Stone Beak allows you to interact with these bird statues littered around the dungeon and gives you hints as to how to progress. Now, some of these are pretty simple, they can be figured out on your own, but for later dungeons, they are immensely useful. In the later dungeons, there are some very cryptic puzzles that need to be solved, and so finding these Stone Beaks becomes a very high priority, as these hints are often the key to figuring out what to do. And these aren't just telling you how to solve a puzzle like Fi does in Skyward Sword. No, instead it's more like a riddle that you have to use context to figure out. And while they're not that difficult, it's just way better than getting told what you have to do. This is one of my favorite aspects of this game because it lets the dungeons get pretty difficult without being impossibly cryptic, and I wish they brought it back for another game. But anyways, back to the Tail Cave specifically, you get the most useful item in the game in this dungeon, the Roc's Feather. This allows you to jump and is extremely useful. You see a ton of gaps in this dungeon that you can't cross, so when you get the Roc's Feather, all the places that you couldn't access before become flooding back, and you start moving back through rooms to find things you've missed. While this is basic Zelda dungeon design, it really does effectively serve the role of being a beginner dungeon. Sure, it's easy and basic, but it's really well designed and a fun dungeon. After getting the Roc's Feather, you can access a few new areas, get a new key and unlock the stairs to the Nightmare Key, and finally, confront the boss. The boss of this dungeon is Moldorm, a pretty iconic boss from the last game, Link to the Past. All you do is slash the tail and beat it. Pretty simple. Afterwards, you get your first instrument, the Mooncello. You need to collect 8 of these to wake up the Windfish, and yes, how did you guess? All 8 of these are in the dungeons in this game. So overall, a great start to the game. Not even 50 minutes of playing and you've already been introduced to the inhabitants of the world, given the objective, and completed the first dungeon. In terms of Zelda games, this introduction is perfect and wastes no time. Everything has a purpose and nothing overstays its welcome. Now after you finish the dungeon, you make your way back to Mabe Village to find out that moblins have taken one of the residents' pet chain chomps. Yes, this game is weird, and so you need to get them back. So after fighting through a moblin camp, you get access to Bow Wow the chain chomp, an integral part of getting to the next dungeon. Now Bow Wow is an absolute unit. He can eat any enemy that gets in your way, and that includes these impassable flowers in the grotto. So even this early in the game, Link's Awakening is shaking things up and having you talk and interact with the villagers. Helping the villagers inherently helps the player and incentivizes you to talk and help anyone you meet throughout the game. Now with Bow Wow being the good boy that he is, he clears the path for us to enter the second dungeon, the Bottle Grotto. The Bottle Grotto, while still being a simple dungeon in comparison to the later ones, already steps up the complexity a bit. There are a ton of different routes you can take, and the first section of the dungeon has 3 keys alone, and they're not used immediately. This shows the player that collecting keys is a great thing, and they may need to use them for way later in the dungeon. We are also introduced to a few new enemies, like the Shy Guys, which are basically puzzles in themselves. They mimic every action you do and are invulnerable from the front, so you have to figure a way to get behind them. This leads to a decent challenge, as there are pots blocking you in this first room, so you really have to think about how you move. You're also introduced to the switches in this dungeon, one of the most common dungeon objects in the dungeons. Slashing it makes it switch colors, which brings up or brings down different panels around the dungeon. This dungeon is mostly focused on teaching you how these switches work and how they can both impede and help you. This is one of my favorite elements in these dungeons, as it immediately increases the complexity just by being there. It makes you think about which options you have and if you have to use the switch to progress, or sometimes you have to figure out how you can even get to the switch without messing up your route. It's just a beautiful mechanic that I really miss because they're not that prevalent in newer Zelda games except for Link Between Worlds. The dungeon item this time is the Power Bracelet, which lets you pick up objects like rocks and pots. This immediately opens up the dungeon, as there are a ton of pots placed all over that block you, so being able to pick them up and smash them is fucking satisfying. Finally, the puzzle to get the Nightmare Key is pretty neat. To get the key, you have to defeat the enemies in this room in a specific order. Now, while you can just get this through trial and error, there's actually a bird statue that gives you the riddle to solve it. And if you forget what it said or you missed it, there's stairs from the room that leads to the statue so you can get a refresher. This is wonderful design, as some people may not have gotten the stone beak at the time when they got to the room, or they just forgot so they need to go find the bird again. This makes unnecessary backtracking really not even in this dungeon, as it really just connects and interweaves in a perfect way to lead the player into what they need. Lastly, the dungeon boss is Genie. Again, it's a pretty simple boss fight. You have to throw his bottle a few times, and then it's pretty standard, just avoid and slash the boss. If I had to criticize this game for one thing, I'll say that most of the bosses are nothing special. They aren't bad, but a lot of them lack creativity in special ways to kill them. This applies to the early game bosses especially, as the late game ones we'll come to see are sometimes pretty fun. But after killing the Genie, we get the next instrument, the conch horn. Now at this part of the game, you've probably encountered some NPCs that are looking for specific items. This is all connected to the overall trading quest in this game. Now a trading quest is pretty common in Zelda games, but they're usually optional and give nice but non-essential rewards. This is where Link's Awakening is different. Now the trading quest is required to even get to the third dungeon, which I'll get to, but it also is required to beat the game. This makes you do the entire quest and help all the different inhabitants of Koholint Island, making you just that much more attached to them. Now for the third dungeon, you have to do a decent amount of the trading quest, all the way up to getting the banana to give to the monkeys. This is required as you need 5 gold leaves from this castle so you can get the dungeon key for the third dungeon. The third dungeon is Key Cavern, and well, it has a lot of keys. While this still is a decent dungeon, in my opinion, it's not as good as the last two. The big gimmick of this dungeon is that there's a ton of roots with a ton of keys that you need to find, but really, a lot of these keys are useless and are only there because you can't expect the player to choose the right door to unlock on their first playthrough. This leads to the dungeon being bloated with a ton of rooms and keys that aren't really necessary, especially in this room. This basement area is absolutely horrid because you only really need to go through the right door, making the rest literally useless. This means that the only thing to do in the other rooms in this area is to get more keys to unlock another door until you find the right one. This is really annoying, especially because one of these rooms has these annoying ass bird enemies. You can't kill these with your sword because they teleport away, so you have to slowly throw bombs at them. But at least it's satisfying to mow them down with the dungeon item when you get it. And speaking of the dungeon item, in Key Cavern, you get the Pegasus Boots, another really useful item, letting you dash around the dungeons and the overworld. Although this dungeon doesn't really make full use of it, after you get it, there's only 2 puzzles that you need it for. One of the best things about Zelda dungeons is that when you get the dungeon item and everything you couldn't get to is suddenly available. The places of interest that you couldn't get to yet invoke a feeling of excitement and makes you remember them for when you get the item. And it would be different if this dungeon was a huge navigation puzzle, but at the end of the day, it's a simple dungeon with just a bunch of keys to look for. At least the boss uses the item in a somewhat interesting way. The boss of the dungeon is Slime Eyes, and you need to stretch it thin so you can ram into it with your boots to split it. For such an okay dungeon, this is actually the first boss that I like, so there's that. Now to get the next dungeon key, you have to bring Marin to the Animal Village, a wonderfully goofy village full of animals, as the name suggests. This leads to one of the best scenes in Zelda. In this calming moment, Marin opens up to you about what she wants to do, to leave the island, to sing across the world. It's an amazingly simple yet impactful scene that really makes you care for her as a character. And it's these simple scenes that really makes Link's Awakening special. It's comparatively trivial, yet it's still just as impactful as killing Ganon in Ocarina of Time, just due to how Marin is portrayed. The Switch version also makes this scene so much more beautiful as you see the vast ocean and hear the waves crashing. But anyways, with Marin's help, we move through the Animal Village and get the key to the next dungeon. The 4th dungeon is Angler's Tunnel, and I think this is when the dungeons really start to pick up. Now, being the water dungeon, there's a shit ton of, well, water, But there's both shallow and deep water. The deep water you can't get into without drowning, so half the dungeon is essentially blocked until you get the dungeon item. This makes a wonderful dungeon, as the first half is basically a navigation puzzle of finding the route to the dungeon item. While doing this, you're shown a multitude of things that could help you progress if you could swim, which makes getting the flippers, the dungeon item, a really satisfying moment as everything just opens up. There's also this room where you kill all the enemies and a key drops like usual, but instead it falls through the gap into the basement. This makes the player remember to be on lookout for stairs to the basements so they can get a key that's down there. There's also this puzzle with the spaces. The first time shows you have to step on them in a certain order, so when you see the same kind of puzzle in this other room, you know that there's a correct order to step on them. Now maybe the dungeon does tell you the order for this room, but because I got the stone beak literally at the very end of the dungeon, I just brute forced it. All of this combines into a great dungeon that's not too hard or easy. Its layout is simple, but the challenge is navigating through the water dungeon when you can't swim. This again makes the moment when you get the flippers so satisfying as all the options just open up and run through your mind. There's only one downside: the boss. The boss of this dungeon is the anglerfish, and it's just a fucking fish. There is nothing intimidating about this boss, and on top of that, it's extremely easy. I would be surprised if anyone has actually died to this boss because it barely attacks you. All it does is swim left and right and summon piss-weak goons. It's by far the worst boss in the game, and honestly, one of the worst bosses in Zelda. Once we're out the dungeon, we see that we're followed by this cute little ghost who's asking us to bring them to their house. This part of the game is pretty self-contained, but always leaves an impression on me. The way the ghost is dealing with the grief of being dead is pretty depressing, but at the same time, it's a bit sweet as it seems that the ghost finds a bit of peace with their death. Again, this is something that has nothing to do with the main story, but instead is a method to further make the player attached to this quaint little island and the beings that are on it. After this, we're able to enter the next dungeon though, so let's take a look at Catfish's Maw. Personally, Catfish Maw is my least favorite dungeon in the game. The big gimmick of this dungeon is that you have to chase this boss around the dungeon and fight him 4 times before you can get the dungeon item. This sounds cool in concept, but when actually playing through the dungeon, this becomes a tedious drag. You have to backtrack and run all over the dungeon multiple times because you have to do these fights in order. This wouldn't be so bad if the dungeon wasn't designed with so many roadblocks that force you to go the long way to get to the other end. And you don't get the teleport circle until you beat the skeleton. This just becomes boring and tedious at a point. I will say that after that part of the dungeon, it does get a lot better. The hookshot has a ton of uses, and the riddle of having to dive into this area of the water is pretty cool, but the fact you get the hook shot so late into the dungeon doesn't help me from thinking that this is the worst dungeon in the game. That being said, the boss is at least pretty cool. The slime eel is the boss of this dungeon, and it's pretty fun to fight. You have to wait for it to pop out one of these holes and then hook shot its mouth to drag it out and slash at its weak point, but overall it's just an annoying dungeon. After the dungeon, we head on over to the ruins where we learn more about what the island actually is. It's an illusion created by the windfish. This moment is a bit unnerving because it makes you question if any of the people you've interacted throughout the journey are even real, or if you even want to accept that. It's a heartbreaking truth that the game drops on you and recontextualizes all of the bosses you fought so far. All they want is to keep existing, to not be forgotten, and to disappear, to be real. It's an interesting thing that the game tells you, and it lets it fester in your mind, questioning your actions. But never mind that, we have another dungeon to conquer. The Face Shrine is when I'd say the dungeons start to get really good and complex. The Face Shrine uses the same switches that we've seen before, but now forces you to think of the dungeon as a whole, because these switches that you hit to progress in the next room may impede your progression in a room much further in. This forces you to think about the dungeon and how to progress. This dungeon is also huge. The map takes up a whole screen, and there's so many different rooms interweaving between each other and making it a maze to navigate. Despite how complex this dungeon is, I found it to be way more navigatable than the Catfish Maw just because of how it was designed to funnel you into the right direction eventually. There's also this really cool puzzle with the chess pieces. Throughout the dungeon, you'll run past this hallway a few times and see these chess pieces, which builds intrigue. Then when you actually make it to the room, it seems like all you have to do is throw the pieces onto the slots, but when you throw them, they bounce in seemingly random directions. But if you pay attention, you see that they actually move like chess pieces, as they are, so you have to position yourself correctly to throw them so they end up in the right slots. This may sound like a simple puzzle, but it feels so unique and rewarding to notice this behavior from the pieces and to figure out what to do. The dungeon item is the upgraded power bracelet, letting you pick up heavier objects. While it may be somewhat of a boring item, this dungeon still puts it to full use with its myriad of heavy statues that you need to pick up and throw to open up new rooms. Finally, the dungeon boss is Facade, a giant face on the floor. While it's a pretty cool concept for a boss, unfortunately it's pretty easy to fight. All you have to do is put a bomb down on its face and boom, that's it. A very cool idea for a fight that unfortunately doesn't reach its full potential because of how easy it is. Now we go and get the Song of Soul from this frog with an annoying ass sign puzzle, and then we head over to Mabe Village. Under the bird statue is, well, an actual bird, but it's dead. So we have to use the Song of Soul to revive it, and then use it to cross the mountains to get to the next dungeon. The next dungeon is the Eagle's Tower, which is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated dungeons in all of Zelda. Eagle Tower is by far the most unique dungeon in this game. To even be able to see the boss door, you have to break these 4 different pillars on the second floor to bring down the top layer of the tower. The way you do this is with this big cannonball in this shrine-like area. You have to find a way to bring this ball to the 4 pillars, which might sound easy until you see how many gaps, traps, and blockades there are to keep you from reaching them. This makes the dungeon one huge navigation puzzle, as it's an extremely open-ended dungeon. The bottom floor is covered with switch panels that block paths, which makes you think about the dungeon as a whole when flipping the switches, as it may block some routes on other floors. The bottom floor also has a few chests on these side ledges that initially seem impossible to reach. But if you drop down from one of these pits, it actually brings you to the bottom level, which means you have to think about how the floors connect and how to be able to acquire these chests. This dungeon makes you think about your position and the state of the dungeon in a way that really sells it being a big tower that you're navigating. This open-ended nature also lets you get the dungeon item and the nightmare key very early on. In fact, I got both of them before even getting the stone beak. This makes the dungeon feel intimidating, challenging, but still fair. Backtracking isn't too bad, as you can fall through the floor to go down to a different level, and there's a ton of stairs. The cannonball makes traversing through the second floor feel really fresh, as it's really a challenge to get the ball to one of the pillars. Take, for example, this pillar, the last one I needed. To even get on this middle path is quite a journey, but you also see that it leads right to a pillar. Now you might try to just bring the ball over here, but then you find out that you can't throw it that far, so you have to go through the entire floor again to figure out how to get it across the gap. So what you have to do is throw the ball over this gap and then make your way all the way through the dungeon so you can hookshot over and break pillar. This makes Eagle's Tower one of the most difficult dungeons I've played in any Zelda game, and it's amazing. The design of this dungeon seems so complex and overwhelming at the beginning, but bit by bit, pillar by pillar, everything just falls into place, and it couldn't be more satisfying. And then there's the boss fight, Evil Eagle. It might not be the most interesting fight ever, nor the most challenging, but fighting on top of this huge tower that you just conquered and seeing the blue sky in the background is just the perfect setting for the boss fight. The only downside to this dungeon is the dungeon item, the Mirror Shield. It really isn't used that much in this dungeon, and it makes the Mirror Shield feel a bit underwhelming, which is not the case at all, because in combat, the Mirror Shield is very nice. It deflects magic from Wizzrobes, protects you from these stupid ass eye enemies, and even reflects spears. And while it's disappointing that it's so underutilized in this dungeon, it doesn't bother me too much because this dungeon's just too good. Now the lead up to the next dungeon is pretty straightforward compared to the rest. You save Marin, who's been trapped on a bridge, and then you're told to go to Turtle Rock. So after waking up this crusty old turtle, we kill it and enter the final real dungeon. Turtle Rock is the ultimate challenge of Link's Awakening and is by far the most difficult dungeon in the game. Surrounded by lava and given a ton of options to where to go, this takes the navigational puzzle aspect of Eagle's Tower and amplifies it. It's extremely easy to get lost or feel like there's no options left, but there's always something you may have missed, yet it never feels frustrating. It really is a huge interconnected cavern that you have to solve. The open-endedness is perfect for the final dungeon, as it really makes you think about where you're going or how to get to a blocked off path. A ton of these puzzles are very clever too, like the one where you have to fill in every hole with this bridge builder contraption, which also in turn teaches you how these things work and leads to paths that you thought were previously inaccessible. And then they give you a more difficult version later in the dungeon, and it's absolutely amazing. While I don't have as much to talk about on this dungeon, it's just a banger of a dungeon. It gives me the exact feeling I want from a Zelda dungeon, to feel confused and turned around a lot. The need to study the map and the rooms to navigate to where I need to go. The feeling of being lost is essential to a dungeon being rewarding, and that's exactly what Turtle Rock does. Only problem I have is the dungeon item and the boss. The magic rod is the dungeon item, and while it's still used more than the mirror shield, it's obtained so late in the dungeon that it's really only used for a few puzzles. And the boss fucking sucks. Hothead is a really simple boss that doesn't pay off for how good the rest of the dungeon is. All you do is hit it with the magic rod a few times and that's it. It's really simple and not engaging at all, which sucks as the dungeon is near perfect and is really only held back by the boss. And now we finally have all the instruments we need to wake up the Windfish. But first, if you haven't done the trading quest yet, you are essentially required to finish it to beat the game, because you get the magnifying glass from this quest, which allows you to read what the correct directions are in the Windfish egg. If you don't get this, you'll probably just get stuck as the correct route changes from file to file. This makes sure you've fully gotten acquainted with the residents of the island before you beat the game, because yet again, the entire story relies on how connected you are to this island, so it makes sure you've explored it to its fullest at the end. At the end of the Windfish egg, you face the Nightmare. Opposed to other Zelda villains we've had, all the Nightmare really wants is to exist. If the Windfish wakes up, everything will fade out of existence, unable to leave anything behind as proof of their existence. This makes the Nightmare a pretty understandable villain. I mean, if you found out you were a figment of somebody's dream, would you not want to keep yourself alive and keep what you have? This is what makes the Nightmare a very interesting villain, as it really makes you question if you're even doing the right thing. By continuing, you will cause everyone and everything you've seen on this island disappear. It's even reasonable to think that Link is kind of a villain in this context, forcing everyone to fade out of existence just so he can wake up. This dilemma is very refreshing and fleshes out the villains in a very unique way. But of course, this is a Zelda game, so we have to fight the final boss. The Nightmare is a decently long fight with a ton of phases, but it's not necessarily difficult. The hardest part is just figuring out which items you have to use in which phase to deal damage. But after you killed the Nightmare, you're able to wake up the Windfish and get this heart-wrenching scene of seeing everything disappear. Every person, animal, and thing just fading away, never to be seen again. Afterwards, we see Link waking up to the sound of Marin singing the Ballad of the Windfish and realizing everything's gone. It's an extremely impactful scene that makes me tear up upon finishing the game. The raw emotion put into the ending of this game is so special and is the reason I love it so much. The ending is the best in any Zelda game, and it hits so hard. The bittersweetness at the end with Link seeing the Windfish and becoming determined to move on is a perfect balance. And if you beat the game with 0 deaths, which I did not do, you get a special cutscene that suggests that Marin got what she wanted, to become a bird and fly across the ocean. This gives an even sweeter ending for those who replay the game and got better. The fact that Marin somehow got what she wanted at the end and exists in some way is enough for the ending to have a different meaning. Now, how this happened, I have no clue, but I still find it very heartwarming. And with that, that was Link's Awakening. If you couldn't tell, I love this game. Link's Awakening is such a different and special Zelda game that really delivers on pretty much everything it tries. The dungeons are phenomenal, the characters are fun and wacky and very memorable, and the story is just simple yet extraordinarily effective. And with the Switch version, you have beautiful visuals and a remade soundtrack that really updates the game to modern standards. So if you haven't played the game yet and you made it this far, thank you, and please play the game because I truly believe it is a one-of-a-kind game and it's worth playing. Thank you, and have a good day.